Hello all, this is Dr. Bruce welcoming you to the third show in our series, The Spiritual Hitchhiker's Practical Guide to the Afterlife and Beyond. Now this show is the first in a series of two shows where we're going to be exploring how people access past life memories. Reincarnation is an idea deeply rooted in spirituality, metaphysics, and personal experiences. By its very nature, the evidence for reincarnation is primarily anecdotal and subjective, but we also saw last week how it's increasingly becoming the subject of rigorous scientific investigation, which also makes it quite objective as well. There are two principal ways in which individuals can access past life memories: spontaneous recall and past life regression. Now, tonight's show, or today's, depending upon where you're tuning in from, will focus on spontaneous recall. We'll take a look at past life regression next week. Also known as involuntary memories of previous lives, spontaneous recall refers to those memories which arise spontaneously in either the waking state or the dream state. As with any memory, they're susceptible to errors and distortions, or what's called unintentional fabrication. Past life research, such as that conducted by Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who we talked about last week, and among others, is concerned solely with involuntary or spontaneous memories. These memories may be reported by adults as well as children, but they tend to come most naturally and normally from young children. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, and we'll go into all of them, but in part, this is because the recalled lives typically lie in close temporal and spatial proximity to the present life. The children will often ask to be taken back to places, or physical locales, that they remember having lived in. And when their parents take them there, they'll often experience deja vu. They'll guide their parents around the physical locale. Now, an excellent example of this is the Barbara Carlin case, which stands as one of the most remarkable cases of reincarnation ever reported. In case you don't know about this one, Barbara Carlin was born in Sweden in 1954. When she was less than 3 years old, Barbara told her parents that her name wasn't Barbara, it was Anne. She also began insisting that her real parents were soon going to come to get her and take her to her real home. By the way, those kinds of statements are typical of childhood reincarnation cases researched by Ian Stevenson. Around this time, she began to have recurring nightmares of men in uniform running up the stairs and kicking down her door. Also around this time, the same time, she began to further insist that her full name was, in fact, Anne Frank. And I'm sure everyone out there knows who Anne Frank is or was. With the native Netherlands occupied by Nazi forces, Anne Frank and her Jewish family went into hiding in Amsterdam on July 6, 1942. They were discovered 2 years later. Anne Frank's father, Otto, was the only survivor following the liberation of the concentration camps. Anne died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945, less than 10 years before Barbara Carlin was born. Barbara's parents had no idea of who Anne Frank was, as they were not aware of the book Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl, also known as the Diary of Anne Frank, which was first published in the Netherlands in 1947. And if you like me, it was a required reading back in high school. I remember reading that book. Barbara's parents didn't understand the meaning of all what was going on because they never heard of Anne Frank, and of course their young daughter wouldn't have heard of her either, as the book had only been translated into a few languages. And at this point in time, Swedish wasn't one of them. So they regarded their daughter's revelations as simple childhood fantasy. As Barbara Carlin advanced through high school, or rather through school during the 1960s, she was introduced to the story of Anne Frank in class. And as she learned more and more about Anne Frank and read her diary, Anne Frank's diary, for the first time, certain parallels between their lives and things that they had in common began to emerge. Now, like Anne Frank, Barbara Collin was a childhood writing prodigy. At the age of 12, her first book of prose was published. In her teenage years, she had a total of 9 books published. These books, written in her youth, have been translated into multiple languages, and a lot like the Diary of Anne Frank. Now, in addition, Collin's fears seem to relate to Frank's experiences. Here's some examples. Barbara had an aversion to eating beans since childhood, which the Frank family existed on for nearly 2 years. Barbara would also only take baths, not showers. Now, why is this significant? Because in the Nazi concentration camps, the Nazis would bring prisoners into large rooms telling the prisoners that they'd be given showers. But instead of water, poison gas was piped into the room to kill the prisoners. Barbara also resisted having her hair cut. Why is this significant? Well, in concentration camps, new arrivals were stripped naked and their heads were shaved, followed by a process of disinfection. Also, since childhood, Barbara had a fear of men in uniforms. Even as an adult, if she was stopped for a traffic violation by a police officer, should have such anxiety that she would really seriously consider fleeing the scene. Now, all these things, taken in isolation or together, while provocative, admittedly don't constitute proof of reincarnation. You can call them mere coincidence. However, an incident which occurred around the time Barbara was 10 years old provided the first validation that she might very well be the reincarnation of Anne Frank. When she was 10, Barbara's parents took her on a tour of the major cities in Europe, including Amsterdam, the city where the Frank family lived. During World War II, Otto Frank and his family had to go into hiding in the attic of the building where Otto had his business, because the Nazis had invaded the Netherlands and were persecuting Jews. The Frank family hid in this attic for about 2 years until they were discovered by the Nazis, arrested, and sent to concentration camps. Now, the only survivor of the war was the father, Otto Frank, who subsequently was given Anne's diary, which he later had published. Now, after the war, the hiding place was made into a museum, which is called the Anne Frank House. If you've never been there and you're ever in Amsterdam, I urge you to go. I had the opportunity to do that many, many years ago. By the time Barbara was 10, the Diary of Anne Frank had been published and distributed in Sweden. And her parents, at that point, they became aware of who the historical Anne Frank was. Now, while they were in Amsterdam, her father wanted to visit the Anne Frank house. So at the hotel that they were staying at, he asked for a taxi to take them there. And Barbara chimed in and says, "Oh, we don't need a taxi. It's not too far from here." Barbara was so certain that it didn't occur to her parents to question her, to object. They just followed her as she walked off. She herself wasn't at all surprised when they arrived at the Anne Frank house after about a 10-minute walk through the twisting streets of the city. And if you've ever been to Amsterdam, you know that they do have twisting streets throughout the city. Upon their arrival, her parents stood there speechless and just looked at one another. When they finally stood in front of the steps up to the house, Barbara said, "Gee, that's strange. It didn't look like this before." She looked puzzled. Her parents didn't know what to say. They entered the house, went up the long, narrow staircase. Barbara, who had been so carefree when showing them the way, and suddenly went white in the face. She broke out in a cold sweat. When they entered the hiding place, the same terrors overcame Barbara that she had experienced so many times in her dreams. She found it hard to breathe. She had a panic attack spread throughout her body. When they went into one of the smaller rooms, she suddenly stood still and she brightened up a little. Now, here's where it starts to sound like an episode of The Twilight Zone. Barbara looked at the wall in front of her and said, "Hey, look, the pictures of the film stars are still there." See, she was referring to the pictures of the movie stars that Anne had clipped and put on the wall. When Barbara saw that, it made her feel really happy, almost as if she had, as she put it, should come home. But the wall was blank. Yeah, it was blank. Her mother stared at the blank wall and couldn't understand what was going on. She said, "What pictures? The wall's bare." Barbara looked again, and she saw that this was true. The wall was bare. Her mother was so confounded that she asked one of the tour guides whether there had been pictures on the wall at one time. And so the guy told her, "Oh yeah, there were pictures there. They'd only been taken down temporarily to be mounted under glass so that they wouldn't be destroyed or stolen." Barbara's mother didn't know what to say except to ask, well, she asked her daughter, "How in the world could you find your way here, first of all, then insist that the steps outside were different, and then see the pictures on the wall when they weren't there?" Barbara's mother was full of questions, but Barbara, she just wanted to get the hell out of there. She couldn't stand it a moment longer. Well, to make a long story short, Barbara relates that these incidents in Amsterdam finally made her parents believe that she is the reincarnation of Anne Frank. After all, how else could she know how to get to Anne Frank's house on the family's first trip to Amsterdam and without directions? She found it on her own. How could she know that the stairs had been modified? How could she know that pictures of movie stars, which Anne Frank had clipped from magazines, should be found on a specific wall inside the house, when these pictures had been removed so that they could be mounted behind glass? Now, after her adolescence passed, as happens so often, Barbara's past life memories, as common with children, began to fade. And that was a relief to Barbara, because now she could finally lead a normal life. Here is one of the most remarkable and incredible cases of spontaneous recall of past life memories that you'll ever hear. Now, some of you may be familiar with it. During a father-son trip to the Kavanaugh Flight Museum outside of Dallas, Texas, 2-year-old James Leininger became so enamored with the World War II section of the museum that he spent more than 3 hours there, and he didn't want to leave. So soon after they got back home, James began to smash his toy airplanes into the coffee table repeatedly, nose section first, while screaming that the aircraft was on fire. That was when the nightmares began. His mother, Andrea, would find her son thrashing around on the bed in the middle of the night, letting out blood-curdling screams and shouting out, "Airplane crash, on fire, little man can't get out." At the same time, James would be kicking upwards on his bed as if trying to kick open a canopy from inside an aircraft. During a bedtime story, James suddenly began talking to his parents about the nightmares and turning them from night terrors to lucid details and conversations. This is what he told his parents. He told them about flying a Corsair fighter plane during the Second World War and being shot down by the Japanese. And what he said was, "Mama, before I was born, I was a pilot, and my airplane got shot in the engine, and it crashed in the water, and that's how I died." He wanted to explain that he flew off an aircraft carrier called the USS Natomo Bay, and his name was also James. When James was 2.5 years old, he was sitting on his father Bruce's knee. And by the way, Bruce also happens to be a member of this group. I don't know if he's joining us tonight, but he is a member of this group. They were going through a book on the Battle of Iwo Jima. Opening the book to a picture of Mount Suribachi, James said, "That's where my plane was shot down. My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." Determined to get to the bottom of his son's insistence that he was indeed describing the past life of a downed Navy fighter pilot named James, Bruce attended a reunion of USS Natomo Bay veterans under the disguise or the ruse of writing a book, and he was stunned to discover the only pilot killed during the Iwo Jima operation that flew off the off that aircraft, that particular aircraft carrier, was a 21-year-old Pennsylvanian named James Houston. Now, further research revealed that Houston's plane had been hit in the nose and lost his propeller, and that's exactly where little James had intentionally damaged all his toy planes. So, as their belief in their son's extraordinary claims grew, Bruce and Andrea began to take what he said seriously. One night, Andrea said that she was told by James that his past life father was an alcoholic. And when James Houston was 13, they put their drunken dad in the hospital for 6 weeks. So they then tracked down Houston's sister Ann, who was in her 80s by then, and they asked her if these claims were true. And she confirmed them. More staggering coincidences began to occur. James knew details that no 4-year-old or even a 40-year-old would or should know about the operational details of a Second World War fighter plane. For instance, he knew that Corsairs were notorious for getting flat tires. And when he was handed a model of the plane he claimed he flew off the deck of the USS Natomo Bay, he noted that a small antenna was missing from the side. And research by his father found this to be true. Another time, his mother Andrea said that she bought him a toy plane, and she pointed out what appeared to be a bomb on its underside, the underbelly of the plane. And she says James corrected her and told her it wasn't a bomb, it was a drop tank. Now, a drop tank is an extra fuel tank used for long-range missions. And she said, I've never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was. New details began to emerge every day. On a map, James pointed out the exact location where the other James, the fighter pilot's James, plane went down. Asked why he called the action figures he liked to play with Billy, Leon, and Walter, he said, well, because that's who met me when I got to heaven. And sure enough, on the list of the Natomo dead, alongside James Houston, were Billy Peeler, Leon Connor, and Walter Devlin. The most incredible moment, though, was when James attended his first USS Natomo Bay reunion. There, he was stopped in the hallway of the hotel by a fellow by the name of Bob Greenwald, who was a Natomo Bay veteran. When Greenwald asked James, do you know who I am? James said, yeah, sure, you're Bob Greenwald. His father asked him how he knew that, and James said that he simply remembered the man's voice. Greenwald then further corroborated little James's details of Houston's fiery crash, including where Houston's plane was hit and where it went down. Now, like other children with past life memories, James Lineage's memories of a life he led and lost as a World War II Navy fighter pilot, James Thurston, began to fade. Like Dr. Ian Stevenson, his predecessor at the University of Virginia, Dr. Jim Tucker is the first to admit, we spoke about those two last week, he's the first to admit that the startling cases he's meticulously researched and documented aren't proof positive of past lives, but in his own words, the evidence provided by these cases make it hard to come up with an adequate explanation. These children speak accurately and with unswerving conviction about their previous lives, as we saw in the two cases we just looked at. In most cases, these children voice their past life memories between the ages of about 2 and 5. They often use phrases like, when I was big. They'll often grumble about their small bodies. They'll even speak resentfully of not being the same sex as before. And often they'll yearn for the lost company of a husband, wife, son, or a daughter. Sometimes they long for the food, clothing, lifestyle, sometimes even alcohol, drugs, and tobacco of a former existence. They suffer phobias that can be linked directly to their unexpected deaths in their past lives. These past life memory cases include the sorts of signs that have long been recognized as suggestive of reincarnation, but in an integrated, demonstrably veridical manner that make them harder to explain, except as genuine expressions of reincarnation. While more prevalent among children, spontaneous recall can also be experienced by adults. There are many types of hints in our daily lives which might indicate that we lived previously. Most of us, quite honestly, fail to recognize them. These memories can range from vivid recollections of specific events, places, or people, to subtle, even strong feelings of familiarity, strong emotional connections. Now, this isn't meant to imply that there are no other more logical or rationalized explanations for these events, but some of them, depending upon the intensity and detail of the experience, defy logic, as we shall see right now. So what does all this have to do with you? You out there listening to this. I'm now going to go through 21 different signs which will help you recognize the various ways in which past life memories can manifest themselves in your everyday experience. Now, obviously, not all of these are necessarily ascribable to past life memories in every case. So you have to take them as an aggregate total. And by the way, don't bother writing these down, okay? I have these in a PDF format for you as a quiz. So if you'd like, then just email me a request ask for the past life profile, and I'll get it right out to you. You'll find my email address in the comments section on this page. Now, there's also an overlap in some of these as we go. You'll see as we go through these. So let's start with number one. You visited an unfamiliar area, like a foreign city, yet you feel like you've been there before to such an extent that you know where landmarks like hills and old buildings were, or even able to describe the inside of places before you enter them. Number two, you've naturally had knowledge about a particular topic that you've never studied before. For example, speaking a foreign language you've never been exposed to, or being able to recite facts about an historical event you couldn't possibly know. Now, the James Leininger story that we just went through is an excellent example of this. Little James exhibited knowledge about World War II era Corsair fighter planes, and also had knowledge of the incidents of the Battle of Iwo Jima. Number three, you know how to do a fairly complex or specific task, like playing a musical instrument, painting, sculpting, woodworking, knitting, work of the sails on a sailboat, things like that, before being formally taught. And it makes you wonder about the videos you see on Facebook of some 4 and 5-year-old child prodigy playing the piano or violin like professionals. Number four, you have deep-seated yet unexplainable fears of certain places or things that don't seem to have any root, such as boats, water, trains, airplanes, wells, particular types of animals, and so forth, even though you've never had an unpleasant incident regarding any of these. This is very common. In last week's show, I told you about one of my clients who had an irrational fear of being caught in a gas explosion. That's a great example of this. Number five, a particular smell, taste, sound, voice has triggered detailed but unfamiliar images in your mind that feels more like memories, even though they have no basis in your life. Number six, you've been told that you have certain quirks or habits that exactly mirror those of a relative who died before you were born, and which you couldn't have been consciously aware of this or aware of. Some of these might be explainable by genetics, obviously, but the next one, number seven, I find hard to explain by genetics. And number seven is your parents, relatives, or friends have caught you using an old phrase or an expression you couldn't possibly have learned anywhere. Number eight, you have an oddly shaped birthmark whose pattern seems to resemble a wound. Now, birthmarks figure very prominently in Ian Stevenson's work, by the way. Number nine, in the moments before you fall asleep, you've been dimly aware of images that seem to come from an unfamiliar era. Now, there's something interesting about this. Only this morning I was doing a clinical interview with a client. She might even be with us tonight. And I always administer the past life profile to my clients when they sign up for the program. And I don't do past life regressions like most people out there do. I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all. I don't, sign a person into a program, tell them to sit down, close their eyes, shut up, and start talking. My program is a two-session program. The first session is a clinical interview where we get some detailed information from these people. And so this morning, she was telling me exactly what the number 9 that we're talking about here. That when she's falling asleep at night, she very often has detailed recurring images of what could be indicative of a past life. And it always occurs as she's going to sleep. That's logical. As you're drifting off into a deep sleep, you pass to what's called a hypnagogic reverie. These are where past life memories can assert themselves. So that's really interesting. So she went through the clinical interview this morning, and this Sunday we're doing the past life regression with. Actually, we're doing a between lives regression, which I always start with a past life regression. Okay, number 10. You've seen an unfamiliar person or place in a dream, and then later you actually come across the person or the place. Number 11. You've met someone with whom you have an instantaneous rapport. Now the opposite of that is number 12. You have met someone for whom you have an instantaneous, inexplicable dislike, even though you have no good solid reason other than a deep, nagging instinct. Number 13, you've met a complete stranger and correctly guessed their likes and dislikes, for instance, such as a food preference or maybe an allergy. Number 14, you've had vivid, repeated dreams where you're actually embodied as another person, experience events in an unfamiliar life. Number 15, you've had a waking dream or daydream which seemed very much like an actual memory of something that you participated in, and in which unfamiliar images and scenes came to your mind, for which you had a strong identification. Although it might seem like a daydream, the person experiencing it is often surprised by its unexpected, often intense nature, which daydreams usually don't have. Number 16, you've had recurring dreams filled with historical people, places, and things that are unfamiliar to you in your life today. In other words, you maybe find yourself dressed in period clothing or in historical settings, or you've seen yourself living through significant events from other time periods. And by the way, number 17, we're going to talk about recurring dreams, historical otherwise, that never change. That's usually a hallmark of a possible dream indicative of a past life memory, that the events never change, because you wouldn't expect them to change if it was an actual experience or event. So in other words, these dreams the sequences never change, no matter how many times you have that particular dream. Number 18, you've had dreams that display talents, skills, and abilities that you just don't have. For example, in your dream, you have the ability to play a musical instrument that you don't play now, or speak and understand a foreign language that you don't speak now, or understand complex medical or scientific procedures. But in a waking life, you're not actually a physician or a scientist. And you've had artistic talents in your dream that you lack in everyday reality. Number 19, you've had dreams that showed you another, perhaps even darker side of yourself. For example, as a sinner, a villain, miser, evil, cruel, abusive of power or wealth. And that reminds me of somebody of a certain age. Remember a hit song by Frank Sinatra. It was from 1965 called "That's Life." There was a certain couple of lines in that song that kind of resonate with me when we're talking about seeing life from different perspectives. In that song, Frank sang, I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. And maybe old Blue Eyes didn't know it at the time, but maybe he was trying to tell us that, yeah, we do. We do see life from every view, from every possible perspective as we go through our myriad lives. Number 20, you feel inexplicably drawn to certain historical times and places, to the extent that you'll often read books or watch movies and or television shows about these, and you strongly identify with them. Number 21, now this is, I think, the most interesting of all. You've had a deja vu experience, the strange feeling that you're repeating an experience you're certain you've never had before. For example, you enter a building that seems strangely familiar to you, though you know for a fact you've never been there before. Or meeting someone for the first time, you're feeling like you two go way back. Or engaging in fresh conversation with someone and feeling like you already experienced this exact conversation before. Almost to the point that you knew the exact words which were going to follow. Well, this got me to thinking when I first heard about this. If this was indicative of a past life, I could see that the place you might be visiting or have visited in this life, let's say in the 20th or 21st century, could be the same place you visited in a past life in, say, the 18th or 19th century, for example. After all, Rome is Rome, Paris is Paris, Vienna is Vienna, and they have been for hundreds of years. Or the person who seems familiar to you here in your life in the 21st century could have been a different person you knew in the 17th century, for instance. You know them as your, I don't know, your grandfather here, but in the 17th century you knew them as a brother. But what are the odds? Ask yourself, what are the odds that an experience you had or are having in this life, the conversation you're having or have had with someone in this life, would be exactly the same? Incident for incident, word for word, in both lives. Now, one of the topics that we're going to be discussing in further detail, maybe in a month or so, is the multiverse theory. Now, once the domain of science fiction writers, this extremely controversial theory is supported by a number of well-known scientists. These are the physicists and astrophysicists, the quantum physicists, who tend to agree with the existence of parallel worlds and who suggest a possibility of multi-universes. Multiverse is a contraction of the words multiple and universe, and it is a so-called scientific concept which they defend and which many are taken seriously. They believe that no physical laws exist which would prohibit the existence of parallel or worlds or alternate universes. Now, actually, the multiple universe idea was first advanced by a Dr. Hugh Everett back in 1955 in his graduation thesis at Princeton University. It essentially posits that at any given moment, the universe divides into countless similar versions. And the next moment, these newborn or baby universes split in a similar fashion. In one universe, you might be watching this live, this Facebook Live. But in another, you might be reading a book. In another, you might be walking your dog. As Everett explained, the triggering factor for these multiplying worlds is our actions. If we make some choices, one universe instantly splits into two with different versions of outcomes. Other physicists scorned his theory. Everett ended his physics career after completing his PhD. But the story doesn't end there. Everett was later vindicated when his theories were embraced by a number of prominent theoretical and quantum physicists as potentially being accurate. Well, according to the multiverse theory, in one universe, your body can be dead. But in another, it continues to exist, absorbing consciousness, which migrated into that universe. This means, now follow me here, this means that a dead person, while traveling through the same tunnel, we always talk about tunnels, ends up not in hell, not in heaven, but in a world similar to the one he or she once inhabited and just left, but this time alive, and so on ad infinitum. So there is an abundance of places or other universes where our soul could migrate after death, according to a theory called neo-biocentrism, advanced by a Dr. Robert Lanza. We're going to be taking a closer look at Lanza and biocentrism in another show. And in that abundance of places or universes, a soul may choose to reincarnate into one that may be as close as the one they just left, according to another theory, and an intriguing one at that. This posits that we live our lives, past ones included, within certain time periods, generally within a time span of about 150 to 200 years or so. For example, from 1850 to 2050. And we live a number of lives within that time period, learning the lessons and having the experiences we've signed up to learn and experience before moving on to another time period. Each of those lives are lived within an alternate universe or time period, almost indistinguishable from each other, except that each alternate universe was created at a critical decision point. Remember Everett's theory? In this paradigm, we can reincarnate as ourselves, if we choose, into an alternate universe, virtually indistinguishable from the one we just departed, except for some subtle, or maybe not so subtle differences. For example, we might have pursued different careers, or went to different schools, or married different spouses in each incarnation or universe, which of course would lead to a whole different set of lessons and experiences. In this paradigm, the phenomenon which we know as déjà vu, and the literal translation of déjà vu is from the French. It means already seen, or then that déjà vu becomes literally true. Because we have already seen and experienced the event or situation as ourselves in a past life, lived in an alternate timeline, close enough to the present one, so as to have virtually the same events and situations. Of course, this would assume that we have the ability to reincarnate into the past, something we'll explore in a later program. Well, now that I've thoroughly confused you and given you all sufficient reason to doubt my sanity, this would be a good place to stop for the week. Next week's topic will be the second part of the equation of how people remember their past lives, and that is past life regression. And if you think you have a good understanding of past life regression, think again, because I'm going to cover things next week that will take it up to a whole different level. You'll be introduced to some concepts that will give you an entirely different understanding and viewpoint of what's possible with past life regression. So you definitely won't want to miss next week's show. That's next Wednesday, June 26th at 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Tell your friends to join us. Remember, since this show is done within the Facebook group Reincarnation, Past Lives, and the Afterlife, they'll have to be a member to tune in, so you can invite them to join. So thank you for tuning in. And until next week, this is Dr. Bruce wishing you all happy trails.